So the lecture we're going to do today is on Cuba. Now then, in your standards, if you look at Standard 20, what it's basically going to tell you is that you need to be familiar with the Cuban Revolution, the Bay of Pigs, and the Cuban Missile Crisis, and how those things connect to containment. But in order to understand that, we have to kind of reach back World War II, prior to World War II, Great Depression, the mob and the mafia and all that kind of stuff, and take a look at how those different factors and forces are going to influence Cuba and the way that the United States interacts with Cuba. So when you look at the United States and its relationship to Cuba pre-1959, if you look up top at the title bar, basically that year pre-1959 is denoting pre-Cuban Revolution. Cuban Revolution, 1959. So we kind of divide our relationship with Cuba into pre- and post-Cuban Revolution. So pre-Cuban Revolution, which is basically the Roaring Twenties, the Depression, World War II, immediately post-World War II, pretty much what you're looking at is an American playground. There are casinos down there. There are all types of kind of, we would call them today, kind of bar-type scenes. There's big American business there, mostly agricultural and mining industries. And American entrepreneurs own a large portion of those. So over the course of decades of this, where you basically have American business dominating Cuba, American businesses start to build up a lot of infrastructure. They spend a lot of money, and they want the government to protect that investment that they've made inside of Cuba. So when you kind of look at the breakdown that I've given you here, you look at a Cuban economy that's pretty much dominated by Americans. Now there's also a bunch of mafia interests down there as well. When the mob is making all their money during Prohibition, they gotta figure something to do with it. Why not buy a bunch of casinos and build up Cuba to be kind of my little mafia playground? And to a certain extent, they do that a little bit. So that's kind of just a whole other dynamic that we don't have a lot of time to get into, but if you're interested, you can go and do a little bit of research on your own, and there's definitely some connection to be had there. Okay? So eventually what's going to happen is that the Cubans are basically going to become tired of being dominated by Americans, by the United States. And a guy that you've probably heard of before, Fidel Castro, is basically going to say we're done being dominated by America, by the United States. He's the one that leads the Cuban Revolution. Originally, he is not a hardcore ardent communist. Now, he does believe in some redistribution of wealth policies and things like that. But because he favors nationalizing, which is basically taking from the Americans and giving back to the Cubans a lot of the property and a lot of the holdings that the United States corporations have inside Cuba, because he favors that policy, the United States government will, of course, not back him. So, if you're in the middle of the Cold War and the Americans won't back you, guess what? The Soviets will. So, by the United States refusing to aid Cuba in any way, or ultimately putting in place policies that are going to continue to oppress Cubans in order to prop up American businesses, they kind of drive Castro further into the Soviet camp. So, as the United States continues to reject Cuban interests, the Soviet Union continues to endorse them, adopt them, as long as Mr. Castro continues to be communist. So what the Soviet Union is kind of gathering here is this little bastion of communism that's 90 miles off the coast of the United States, which is what the Soviet Politburo, the leaders of the Soviet Union, are loving, that this is right next to the United States. It kind of counters the presence of really Turkey being right next to the Soviet Union. Turkey being democratic to a certain extent, Turkey being to a certain extent capitalist, and that's being right on the Soviet doorstep. Cuba is kind of that counterpart in the Western Hemisphere with the United States. So, the United States, not huge fans of having communist nations right on our doorstep. We don't like it very much. You can kind of reach back all the way to the Monroe Doctrine, the Roosevelt Corollary, where the United States kind of likes to have a totally dominant hand in its own neighborhood, in its own playground. And ultimately, Cuba going communist is kind of a signal of a loss of control by the United States inside the Western Hemisphere, and America does not like that. So Kennedy, in an effort to oust Castro from Cuba, get rid of him, reinstall an American favorable government, he authorizes the Bay of Pigs. The Bay of Pigs invasion, or the Bay of Pigs fiasco that it ultimately turns into, is basically where the United States, or the CIA, is going to train a bunch of Cuban expatriates, Cuban nationals, that have either been expelled from Cuba or left it voluntarily, going to train those individuals up to be basically guerrilla fighters, to go inside of Cuba and lead a revolution. They're promised all this U.S. aid, all this U.S. help. They're promised air support in this kind of operation, and ultimately the CIA deems all of those aid packages to be too high profile, and they end up pulling all the aid, and then these expatriates that end up landing in the Bay of Pigs are pushed back into the sea, basically, by Castro's army. So this is ultimately a huge failure and big national embarrassment, international embarrassment for the United States, and further kind of pushes Castro into the pocket of the Soviet Union. Once the United States tries to invade your country, the CIA, I keep saying the United States, but technically speaking it's the CIA, once they try to invade your country, it's kind of difficult to repair relations. So from this point on, Castro is firmly inside the pocket of the Politburo. As you can see in this top line right here, I mentioned Turkey earlier. Turkey, if you look at a map, you can Google a map right now if you want to, is right on the border of the Soviet Union. The United States is, without getting into too much detail, it has kind of adopted this policy. It's called détente, where basically the United States knows that if they launch nuclear weapons, the Soviet Union will do the same thing, and so in order to ultimately try to win this game, the only way is not to play. So by putting these Jupiter missiles, which are intermediate range ballistic missiles, by placing them in Turkey, these missiles that are capable of hitting just about any city in the Soviet Union, by placing them there, the United States is trying to send the message to the Soviet Union that you don't want to try anything with us, you don't want to mess with us. Well, obviously, the early warning time for the flight time on those missiles is not very long. It's a couple of minutes before they can be at Soviet cities. Conversely, the flight time on the missiles from the Soviet Union to the United States heartland is much longer. So Moscow is seeking a way to kind of even that gap, shorten that the flight time of those missiles. And now that Cuba has become a communist state, this becomes the perfect place to do that. So the USSR is going to respond to the American Jupiter missiles in Turkey by placing their own intercontinental ballistic missiles inside of Cuba. A U-2 spy plane is going to spot these on an overflight over the Cuban countryside and basically take pictures of these launch sites that are being built. Now, these launch sites are built by Soviet soldiers. They're manned by Soviet soldiers, but the Cuban military protects them. So basically, what Nikita Khrushchev, the leader, the premier of the Soviet Union, is saying is that, yeah, we want to put these missiles here, but we don't really trust Castro or the Cubans with these nuclear weapons. Yes, they're our allies, but we're not gonna trust them too much. We're gonna keep them at arm's length. So this standoff that lasts for 13 days, there's an embargo of Cuba where basically the U.S. Navy blockades the island. They say that any ships that are attempting to leave or enter Cuba will be fired upon, and this is kind of the closest we've ever truly been to a third world war, a nuclear war with the Soviet Union, which would have ultimately pretty much ended the world as we know it. So a series of high-level negotiations are going to occur between President Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev of the Soviet Union, where, long story short, the USSR, they agree to take their nuclear missiles out of Cuba, to dismantle them, to put them back in crates, and to ship them back to the Soviet Union. The United States has to make two promises, one of them public and the other one not. The first promise the United States has to make is that they will not try to invade and overthrow Fidel Castro from the leadership position in Cuba. This is not extremely popular and not very proud moment for Kennedy, but the secret concession that he makes, he never could have made publicly. What he's going to say is that he will dismantle and remove the nuclear missiles from Turkey, the Jupiter missiles that I mentioned earlier. He's going to get rid of them. He's going to take them out of Turkey. He's going to ship them out. Now, he can do this because he knows that a brand new category, the Titan II category of intercontinental ballistic missiles, is coming online. So those Jupiter missiles are kind of becoming antiquated, they're old, they need to be replaced anyway. So Kennedy's going to use them as a bargaining chip to help convince the Soviets to get their missiles out of Cuba. Okay, and this last little clip that I've got here for you, this is a linked video. I'm not going to show you the whole thing. I'm going to pause for a second so I can pull the screen out. So now you can see the whole screen. Like I said, I'm not going to play the whole thing for you. I'm just going to give you a little taste of it. But ultimately, if you want to see it,
after World War
go
II,
take a look at it.
Between the former Allies, the United States of America, and
so that wraps up our video lecture on the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Cuban Revolution, and the Bay of Pigs. If you have any questions, make sure you submit them in the mini lecture form request, and we'll take a look at them when you guys get to class.